All right, colleagues, we're here on vote list number 12. I think we're going to start with House Bill 793. Bob?
House Bill 793 on offshore wind was taken up by the Public Utilities Subcommittee on what was it, Tuesday afternoon? And they went through and adopted the bill with the amendments that are in your package. We have actually the amendment from the subcommittee is 293-722. There is an additional amendment from Delegate Adams, which was based on a prior version of it, and there's one portion that he actually wishes to insert as a substitution, which is actually found on page 11 of both amendment packets, and that goes on to page 17 of the bill. Amendment number 1 is, as usual, technical. Amendment number 2 inserts the definition of qualified offshore wind project and then provides that it's located more than 10 miles off the coast for a project selected under the transmission section, or is approved under the existing law after 2123, interconnects to PJM either at a point on the Delmarva Peninsula or through an offshore wind transmission project under 704.3, which is what comes up later in the bill. The amendments on page 3 of the bill, we add to the intent statement from the General Assembly that it's in the public interest of the state to maximize opportunities for obtaining and using federal funds for offshore wind and related projects, including specified labor standards and domestic content requirements to align state law with the federal IRA and the IIJA. That will explain some of the additional things that are placed in the bill. We also start using, as the chair mentioned during the bill hearing, we've added some language concerning the use of preferences given to businesses that are certified under the Federal Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Program, to the extent that these may be many of the same businesses that would qualify as an MBE, but because the program is not race-based, does not require a Croson study, it may be possible to use these preferences without having any further federally based delays. The amendments add specific qualifications for the community benefit agreement. That was originally enacted as part of the, or strengthened as part of CEJA back in 19. Something that a community benefit agreement that has to be in place for an offshore wind project. What this, the amendments will do is more specifically to require that we have essentially labor peace agreements and related mechanisms for binding contractors, subcontractors who will be using these CBAs for and bidding on these projects. Okay, the additional amendments will take somebody who's already gone through round 1. There are the 2 projects that are out there right now that have approvals. To the extent that they're trying to obtain right now a waiver of the 80-20 sharing of federal tax credits with the ratepayer, the amendments authorize them to do so long as that they are, they actually open their books to the commission. They only get the tax credit that is actually required to make their projects work going forward, and that any additional tax credits that they would obtain end up being returned to the ratepayer. The commission has to, and then the amendments also set up essentially a program for the PSC to work with PJM Interconnection, which runs and regulates the transmission facilities that we use, so that the commission has to consult with other states served by PJM to evaluate regional transmission cooperation that could help achieve our goals for both renewable energy and offshore wind goals with greater efficiency. Essentially try to create some sort of a transmission backbone that a number of projects could connect to rather than having each project separately bring their electricity to land with separate cables. This is actually very much most of this is language that came over on the Senate version of the bill, Senate Bill 781, and we're making some additional changes to that. The amendments require the Commission to include or work with PJM to include solicitations requiring proposals for future transmission lines with meshed manner and share landing points, address certain siting, environmental and economic information, including opportunities for public engagement and comment with units of state and local government and the local public. We're dealing here in a section that has the expanded transmission siting, and what is perhaps most pertinent there is that we are, again, trying to have these projects cited together and working with PJM to do so. But that also would be circumventing the standard CPCN process so that there's no dual proceeding. So instead, we're putting opportunities for public engagement and comment by both units of state and local government as well, and the general public as part of this proceeding, instead of having it go through this process and then go back to a CPCN process. Proceeding through, after notice, one or more hearings to receive public comment and an evidentiary proceeding, PSC has to select one or more proposals by order using a combination of funding mechanisms, including the federal funding language, federal funding that is available, and that also demonstrate net benefits to ratepayers in the state when compared with alternative base rate scenarios. And amongst those things, they will have to adopt conditions for the construction operation, consider conditions proposed by PPRP, and also note that the order selecting a proposal, this is again for the expanded transmission, does constitute authorization by the Commission to construct and operate a facility that would otherwise require a CPCN. That's language that we've added here in the House. A number of things that have to be included in the, there is a provision here where the Department of General Services will be doing a competitive sealed procurement solicitation for offshore wind from these projects as essentially a power purchase agreement. Amongst the things that have to be included in the agreements under that plan are a CBA, a community benefit agreement, and also must include a description of, and this is the Senate language, initial plans for mitigating the impacts of construction and operation of proposed offshore wind project on fisheries and the environment, and also the extent to which an applicant will provide for financial and technical assistance to support the monitoring and mitigation of wildlife and habitat impacts associated with the project. That is the language that Delegate Adams, in his amendment 113-123, would replace, instead requiring a description of initial plans for mitigating impact of construction operation of the proposed project on fisheries, marine life, wildlife, habitats, and the environment, and then also the extent to which an applicant will provide for financial and technical assistance to support monitoring and mitigation of fisheries, marine life, habitat, wildlife, and environmental impacts associated with the project. So that's providing more specification, has a wider ambit of wildlife, in particular mammals that might be affected by this language, by a project that DGS would be bidding on here. And there is additional language from the Senate that requires procurements for this this power purchase agreement to include agreements by the contractors to abide by the labor language. Finally, where the Senate language has a required report regarding offshore wind developers for the Supplier Diversity Program, talking about participation of small minority, women-owned, and veteran-owned businesses, we're adding to that language certified federal disadvantaged business enterprises on offshore wind projects. And then finally, there is language we're adding because of the language on small minority, women-owned, and veteran-owned businesses. We need a Croson study. So there's language to add that. Those are the amendments.
On the amendments,
Oh. Are we including Delegate Adams?
I
no,
didn't
we
think
didn't
so.
hear, so, do we hear that amendment yet?
I just described where it would be inserted in the.
Okay, all right.
My fault. Okay, so how do you want to handle this from a procedural standpoint? Move all the amendments but Delegate Adams?
Yes, all these, the amendments
Is that
that were
allowed?
agreed upon, weren't these agreed upon by the subcommittee?
Correct.
Yes.
Yes, so we'll start with the amendments that were agreed upon by the subcommittee, we'll have a discussion,
Sorry.
then we'll talk about Delegate Adams' amendment, by itself. All right, so the motion is, moving all the amendments that were agreed upon in subcommittee, which are all but Delegate Adams' amendments. Obviously, before we, take the vote, I guess there's a few questions or some discussion. Delegate Charkoudian? None? Okay, so, as the bill moved out of subcommittee on the amendments, all in favor say aye. Any opposed? All right, so now we have Delegate Adams' amendments. And could you clarify those amendments briefly again, Bob?
Yes, sir. What this would do, and this is again, in the Department of General Services procurement for power purchase agreement for offshore wind power. In addition to this community benefits agreement, it is specifying a description of initial plans for mitigating the impacts of the construction and operation of the facility. Instead of simply on fisheries and wildlife, it says on fisheries, marine life, wildlife, habitats, and the environment. And then also the extent to which the applicant will provide for financial and technical assistance for monitoring and mitigating impacts on fisheries, marine life, wildlife, habitat, and the environment. The initial, the language adopted by the subcommittee simply said fisheries and the environment in the first instance, and then wildlife and habitat impacts on the second. This is really using both terms, both sets of terms in both places, and specifically adding marine life, which isn't found in either one of them. Prospective.
Yeah, just briefly, the only thing that I added was marine life. Wildlife is land animals. You may construe wildlife to include marine life. I thought it, just to be descriptive, would be a good addition to the amendment. When we say fisheries, there are certain marine life that are not part of the fishery. So I believe that the intent of the bill as it came to us, or as we're looking at it in the subcommittee, is to protect marine life. Therego, I asked to include marine life into the amendment. I didn't take anything away from what was already in the language, just adding marine life to be descriptive.
Delegate Charkoudian?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I just want to clarify. So first of all, I want to start with just saying that the federal government and all of the federal requirements as it relates to building turbines protects marine life, ocean life, like the wildlife, the habitat. So this was sort of a bonus extra that we added in here on top of all the protections that are currently necessary. And in some ways, I think the amendment that we already adopted is kind of overkill in terms of what's needed, just because it is taken care of at the federal level. But given that we have that in there because there was interest within this body to reference that, I do think it's important that the language, that we're precise with our language, and the first one is related to mitigating impacts, and so we certainly want any construction that happens to mitigate any potential impacts. The second one is related to adding additional financial and technical funding beyond what it takes to mitigate impact. So anytime we're asking a developer that we're subsidizing with, in this case, state money, in other cases, ratepayer money, anytime we're saying, and on top of everything else, we want you to contribute money to this fund for this purpose, what we're essentially doing is just asking them to, raise the cost to us to then put that money into something else that we care about, which doesn't make sense, right? So they already have to mitigate the impact. We're already requiring that they're not causing harm. If on top of that we say, plus give us a little bit of extra money because we care about these things and we want some money to go into it, now we're just raising the cost to the state of entering into this project. So there's already redundancy with federal law in the mitigation and the protection part of it, and I would just caution us against adding language that could increase the cost. And then the last thing I just want to say is, that the marine life reference, there's zero evidence that anything related to offshore wind has anything to do with whale deaths. And so there is a concerted effort of misinformation trying to tie offshore wind to whale deaths. We have extensive evidence and we have opinions by NOAA and every federal agency who's concerned about whales that that's not the case. And I'm concerned that to add that in here because there is this misinformation campaign would only reinforce that misinformation that's out there. And it's really important that we're making our decisions here in the General Assembly based on actual science, not misinformation campaigns. So I would urge us to resist that amendment.
Yes.
So I'm not going to the mat on this over the technicality. What I'm saying is the definition of wildlife, if I were to break out a dictionary and say, what is wildlife? It could be construed to include marine life. So if the legislative intent is to say wildlife, all I'm saying is let's be descriptive. And if you want to put it in uncodified language at the end of the bill, to just make sure that when this bill passes that we are saying that wildlife includes marine life, I'm fine with that. And furthermore, to the extent that we are, number one, asking the developers to put a plan in place that protects marine life, and that you're objecting to that is a little bit just interesting, but double down and say that the part two of that is that we would allow dollars to be invested, state dollars to be invested, to help subsidize and help these developers mitigate the effects on marine life. If you're opposing that because you're worried about ratepayer dollars, again, I'm left sort of speechless. I'd ask to move the amendment. I don't see this as being anything other than clarifying and constructive.
Now we have a lot more questions. I know there's a brief conversation going on between Delegate Charcuti, but I believe there are a few more people who want to, I guess, throw their hat into the ring. Delegate Pippy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to just point out that a lot of the bills, and I won't say where I've seen them coming from, but I'm just surprised that all of a sudden we're now worried about the cost on ratepayers and other folks, to be honest with you. And then second, we've seen bills where you can't build a building in Maryland without worrying about little birds smacking into the side of them. And so now we have literally the largest mammals on Earth washing up on shore, and we can't even consider that as a, quote, scientific consideration. So, I think this is important. I think we should discuss the merits of the amendment. And with the amount of money that we're sinking into these offshore windmills, this is a tiny, tiny piece of the puzzle here. So I appreciate the maker of the amendment's motion here. Thank you. Isn't that so?
Thank you. Delegate Weigel?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two questions. So if the study comes back and say the project is detrimental to wildlife, marine life, all that, what happens? What do we do? Do we stop the project? Is the bill specific on that?
Well, this is something which is, that is required in the agreement that's entered into by GGS. Presumably, if it finds that there is a detrimental impact, they would have to find some way of mitigating it, as opposed to necessarily stopping it. But that's.
So is the project halted until it's mitigated, or it doesn't say?
This is all something in terms of the DGS, which is in consultation with the commission, coming up with a competitive sealed procurement solicitation. So this is what's being required before anything actually goes forward. This is in the process of procurement.
Okay.
So.
And then my other question dealt, I guess, more with the other amendments. Is the taxpayer still paying for the transmission network, or was that amended out?
I don't understand your question, sir.
I believe the state or the PSC was directed to build the transmission network to service the windmills?
They're not directed to build it, they're directed to organize it and make sure that as these developers come in, that they're just not doing it all higgly-piggly, that there's actually a plan put in place. So more developers participate over time. They're not just randomly running wires and lines out.
So who's paying for that?
It would obviously be the developer, and I guess, obviously when you do any kind of upgrades to the network or the the grid, obviously the ratepayer pays their share too for the benefit we receive.
They have to go after IIJA funds to minimize the impact on the ratepayer. And that's why we make them go to the PSC and open up their books.
Correct.
All right, thank you.
Delegate Fisher?
Oh, thank you. So I was thinking about this the other day because in my real job, I build cell phone towers, and these are basically cell phone towers, except they're massive. So every day I get an update from the FAA of the latest applications for cell phone towers, but they also now are in control of wind turbine applications for all the obvious reasons because of aircraft and so forth. That's why we have to file with them. And yesterday I got a notification of a 948-foot tall, above ground level tower for a wind turbine off of Fenwick Island, 948 feet. So the cell tower I just built in King George County, Virginia is 195 feet tall, and it has 50 feet below the ground level of 6 feet of concrete. It's reinforced steel rebar to keep it in place so it can withstand 130 mile an hour sustained winds. When we build that, we have to get a slurry and slurry out, because you obviously are going to hit water. We have to slurry out the water, and that actually involves it's a huge environmental impact. You have to actually clean that water and the sludge before you put it back onto the ground. It's 50 feet below ground for a 195-foot tall monopole tower, which is literally exactly what these wind turbines are. They're monopoles and they're towers, but with a big, wind turbine on top of it. This is 948 feet that was just filed with the FAA. I don't know how far below the ground it goes on the seabed. I don't know how they're attaching it to the ground, how deep they have to go, whether it's being pile driven. I don't know any of those things. But the idea that that doesn't have an impact on the environment, and a really negative impact, is simply not so. And I know this because this is what I do for a living. There's an enormous impact. And so because cell towers are a known entity, we know what we have to do. This is not known at all. It's very new. And again, I would just ask you to think about a 195-foot tall pole compared to a 948 tall pole, and the massive pole that would be. So thank you.
Go ahead, Delegate Aaron.
Just to be clear, you said something a few minutes ago about the cost. The total cost of this is falling on the ratepayers. Isn't that correct?
No.
So we're going to pay somebody, they're not going to charge us anything to do this?
We're going after the IRA funds first.
Okay.
They're getting as much as they can. Go ahead. Go ahead, Brian.
There is obviously cost to it. However, I assume you're talking about the 80-20 split and the exemption.
Yeah.
So that is to, and I believe I misspoke earlier to Delegate Weibel, and I apologize, but is IRA funds that are out there. So there's a whole bunch of federal tax dollars out there. Go ahead.
They're tax dollars, okay.
Correct, but they're available to all 50 states, right? And so unless you go out there and get them, another state could either benefit from it or it just languishes, so you have to be aggressive in getting it. What we are saying, because of the way wind is set up, when developers go after any pot of money, right, that since the ratepayer subsidizes the bulk of wind, we give the benefit of any grant or any federal dollar, 80% of that goes to the ratepayer. They're coming in, the developer. What?
We were here.
So we're saying if you want the exemption from the 80-20 split, that 80% that goes to the ratepayers, you need to come in and demonstrate to the PSC that you truly need the full 100% of that money to make sure that the project pencils itself out. Anything that is over that, by the way, we mandate that they go after the maximum amount of tax credit, because anything that is over that, over what is needed, they still have to go out and get it, and then the remainder goes to the ratepayer.
And just one last thing, I just received an email about the surcharge, the Empower surcharge.
That's not this bill. That's
I'm
next
sorry.
bill.
Okay.
And I'm gonna get hot about that.
All right.
So let's get back, please, to the amendment.
Yes.
All right? So what I do understand, it sounds like what the good delegate is asking is that there be some kind of study done, or we have something that protects marine wildlife prior to these things being built. Delegate Charkoudian.
But the federal NEPA process protects marine wildlife. And that is the process that they have to go through. Just as the federal, I think it's a federal agency that you have to answer to in terms of the cell towers. It's not a state agency that does that. It's a federal agency that they have to answer to in terms of the turbines. The only reason that this was added was to allow for us in this state to also be able to take a look at some of the same things that they're filing with the federal agencies, so we would have that on record when DGS does this. But there's an entire federal agency that is responsible for protecting wildlife. The NEPA process takes care of
And
it,
to be clear, wildlife in this instance.
including marine life, yes.
Including marine life. So that's what I wanted to get to, regardless of intentions or whales or anything, is that this is already required. And when we start drafting state law that's duplicative of federal law, and we mess it up just a little bit, now we've really created some confusion. And so if your goal is to protect marine life, and as you've heard, it's already under the NEPA study required that the study be done, it sounds like we're being duplicative. Delegate Adams. That's my issue.
So if you're saying to me that wildlife includes marine life, is that what we're saying, council? Is that word?
Yes.
Okay. Then the plan, there's two things here that's happening. A plan is being put in place. That's not a NEPA process. That is a process that the state's putting in this legislation. That plan speaks to environment, wildlife, and I don't have it in front of me. I think there was a third category there. And that if needed, there was to be subsidies and the state's involvement in assisting on the mitigation of those effects. So when I think wildlife, I think, okay, well, offshore wind turbine is going to affect birds because we're only putting them so many miles offshore, so that's going to happen. That's wildlife. I would imagine that this bill could be construed to mean that you're going to have transmission projects that are on land, and so there's probably some concern as to wildlife as it relates to as we're running large transmission lines, and so there's that. When I think the environment, at no point in time in any of that wording on those two parts as we were reviewing the bill in subcommittee, did I think that we were talking about anything other than fisheries when it comes to what's under the water line. So when I think fisheries, I don't think of anything other than tuna in the ocean, dolphin, which is mahi-mahi, sea bass. I mean, so whatever the limit to fisheries, we're protecting the commercial watermen in that setting. We're not protecting marine life. And so by adding the amendment, I'm not trying to be provocative, although I brought this up in subcommittee, and I'm not trying to be part of a misinformation campaign. I'm trying to be clarifying for the purpose of the state, which should have an interest in what happens when these projects go up. And not only do I think that that's the case, I know it is, Mr. Chairman, because we're willing to put subsidies and dollars towards the mitigation.
So again, but you heard my explanation as to when we do things and it's duplicative, we oftentimes mess them up. We word them in such a way where we actually create loopholes where there were none before because the feds are already requiring it. So that's what I want to make sure that's understood. Is that, to my understanding, talking with counsel and doing my investigation here, is that everything you're asking for is required by federal law. And we have to abide by federal law as to these developers also, before they can lay anything to the water, into the substrate and all that, they also have to abide by federal law. And so my concern is when we, again, draft our own version of a federal legislation and we don't do it right, we create loopholes that now actually cause more damage to the environment than we had hoped to protect. So that's why I wasn't exactly for the amendment because it's already being done and it's already required. I don't believe you're trying to do anything with misinformation. I believe it has more to do with unnecessary redundancy. Delegate Charkoudian, is your mic just going to be on this whole time?
Probably.
Go ahead.
Yeah, probably.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to just highlight that we, this language here, which you'll see we added, like I added this language, working it out with the National Wildlife Foundation, because I wanted to make sure that it was precise, and I wanted to make sure that it lined up with NEPA, and I wanted to make sure we didn't add things in Maryland that are redundant or get in the way of. And so, just so you all know, the very groups that are committed to protecting these organizations and have a level of expertise that I don't have are the ones who negotiated this specific language with me. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Help. So I just pulled up, according to Maryland Code Natural Resources 10-101, it defines wildlife. And it says, wildlife includes mammals, birds, amphibians, and reptiles which spend a majority of their life cycle on land, or any part, egg, offspring, or dead body of any of them. No, I mean, just this is a Maryland law that defines wildlife.
Has to be done for these large-scale products. That's a federal thing. It's not Maryland law at all.
He was just asking
No,
if
no,
wildlife
I'm not-
included
Oh, no,
marine life.
But, okay, on a federal level, it does. So that's what I get his point. Again, I don't think anybody's moving here in bad faith.
No, sure.
I don't believe anybody is, except for my vice chair. So I just want to make sure that there's an understanding here that nobody's saying we don't care about the wildlife if it's in the water.
I just wanted to be the Bob Smith of the scenario here and just give you the Maryland law and then walk away. That's all.
Don't
You know
fall
what I
for the
mean?
bait, Bob. Okay. No, we trust you. We understand, but that's,
What I can tell you, Delegate, is from years staffing the Environmental Matters Committee, Title 10 of the Natural Resources article is what's dealing with hunting licenses. So that's the scheme for how you regulate, how you protect or don't protect land from being hunted, as opposed to Title IV, which deals with fisheries and crabs and all of that. So I don't recall specifically, but it's used in it's a different context.
and we're also, again, I don't want to start conflating the words wildlife depending on where they're on the statute, because we're talking about this amendment, a NEPA study versus us requiring something additional or weirder or less effective and causing a problem. Because I've gotten some texts from Democrats that also want to make sure we're protecting the wildlife. It's not just Republicans that care about the environment. Wink. It's so, but I want to make it clear that any of these things being constructed, they have to go through that NEPA study. Any impacts to wildlife, fisheries, the ocean has to be taken into account prior to that final approval. Am I wrong? That's all I'm trying to get to. So my worry about redundancy is we don't always get it right. We create loopholes when we don't get it right. And then we end up not saving the thing we're trying to save. That's where we are. So go ahead, please.
I understand what you're saying about redundancy, but we do that here. My very first year, we had legislation that protected women against sexual discrimination in hiring in the workplace. That's a federal mandate, and we passed that in the General Assembly, and I remember happily voting for it. So I understand what my good friend is doing, and I appreciate what he's doing, and I look forward to hopefully being able to vote yes on the amendment.
Well, and I also say where the amendment's put, it's put in the, what part of the bill? It's the procurement part, which also is not remotely where it's supposed to go. I want to get to that because I was just trying to get to the substance because I understood that was important. It can't go where he wants it to go. That's the procurement section. It's not in the construction section, so.
Just to be clear, though, I mean, the amendment literally adds the word wildlife.
Marine life.
2 words. It adds the words marine life. Okay, cool.
All right, Crosby, go ahead and rage out.
Move on favorable.
On the unfavorable, do we want to do a roll call?
Do we do that
Huh?
for amendments?
Can't do what I want to. I'm the
Yeah,
chair.
you can, you're right. You got a seat too?
No, I mean, out of respect for the delegate, and yes.
I'm going to withdraw the amendment.
Okay, don't you do this to me on the floor. Don't you do this to me.
Okay.
I didn't say don't let it be done. Don't you do this to me on the floor.
Mr. Chairman, for 9 years, I've been on this committee, and I've never been part of a misinformation campaign. The amendment was brought in good faith.
I made
And
sure
I don't want to
clarified
make a
that.
roll call of an issue that I think I understand where you're coming from, and I also think you understand where I'm coming from.
Okay.
So.
All right, no, I was just saying-
So out of respect for the committee, I'm not going to call
I just,
for
after
a vote.
our mistake that we both made last year, I want to make sure that if you want to do this
I'm not
somewhere else-
going to be second reader.
There you go. That's
Okay.
all I'm asking you guys to, because I understand your strong feelings. All right, so the amendment is withdrawn. We are now on the amendments that were approved out of the, came out of the subcommittee.
Move the bill as amended.
Any discussion on the bill as amended? Seeing none. Delegate Crosby?
Aye.
Delegate Harrison? Delegate Boafo? Delegate Howard? Delegate Charkoudian? Delegate Rose? Delegate Pruski? Delegate Fennell is excused. Delegate Turner is apparently excused. Delegate Sample Hughes? Delegate Valderrama? Delegate Chi? Delegate Frazier-Odago? Delegate Adams? Delegate Arentz? Delegate Pippy? Delegate Jackson? Delegate Johnson? Delegate Rogers? Delegate Ampry? Delegate Weibel? Was here. All right. Is excused. Delegate Fisher? And Delegate Queen. Bill moves as amended. Next bill, please. Got you. Yeah, we'll get you next time. All right, we have the House Bill 1035. Why is my name on this bill?
House Bill 1035 is the bill that rewrites the Empower Maryland statute, currently 7-211 of the Public Utilities article. With the amendments as adopted by the Public Utilities Subcommittee, it makes a number of changes, including putting in targets and goals taken from House Bill 169, and some additional matters for restructuring how we do energy efficiency, not merely for purposes of reducing peak loads and reducing overall energy consumption, per capita energy consumption in the state, but also taking account of greenhouse gas reductions. So with the amendments that were adopted by the subcommittee, a number of things. We defined a few terms. One of the things that was taken in subcommittee was we have a demand response program that is defined as a program established by an electric company that promotes changes in usage. The subcommittee added an electricity supplier or third party as well, because those are other entities that might be responsible for putting together a demand response program. The amendments also define low-income program, low-income residential. Those are from House Bill 169. And a plan is something to achieve greenhouse gas emissions reductions through energy efficiency conservation, demand response, and beneficial electrification. As we continue through the amendments, the Commission is required to adopt rate-making policies that provide for a surcharge line item on customer bills on or before January of 27, full cost recovery of reasonably incurred costs for programs and services, including full recovery on a current basis, on or before the end of 2031, the elimination of unpaid costs and unamortized costs that existed as of the end of this year and were accrued for the purpose of achieving statutory targets, and also reasonable financial performance incentives and penalties for investor-owned utilities, both electric companies and gas companies. let me see, the commission has to require by regulation and order plans that cover each ratepayer class with a 3-year program cycle, achieve greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, and then have to measure those using, from electricity, data obtained from PJM. And as a baseline for gas emission reductions, have to use a greenhouse gas reductions compared with emissions from Maryland buildings in 2020 as determined by MDE. I think I've been seeing a few emails back and forth. I know there has been some discussion as to whether that was a appropriate test year, but that's what we have in the amendments. For going from 2024 through 2032, the commission has to determine an overall statewide greenhouse gas emissions reduction target of at least at 1.8% reduction on an annual reduction for the baseline. That's statewide. That is not done utility territory by territory. Commission may prioritize long-lived emissions reductions by establishing a minimum weighted average measure for the plan of each electric company and gas company. As we continue through, for weatherization or of leased or rented residents, this is something basically from 169. DHCD has to adopt regs that ensure the benefits of weatherization accrue primarily to low-income tenants occupying leased or rented residents, and also not result in rent increase or eviction as a result of weatherization. Again, most of that is from House Bill 169. The commission has to order at least as soon as possible in 2023, and at least 8 months before the filing deadline for the plans after 2023, commission has to issue an order fully allocating amongst electric companies, gas companies, and DHCD the total amount of statewide greenhouse gas emissions reductions. We have language that requires each electric company and gas company that has already been in the program has already submitted a plan before July 1st of this year. They have to consult with Commission, OPC, MEA, and MDE concerning the design and adequacy of their plans. There's a 3-month delay for those entities that have not been in such a program, primarily some of the smaller gas companies. And then similarly, the plans have to be actually filed by September 1st, 2023 if they've already been in the cycle, or by 1st of December if they haven't been in the cycle. Again, a 3-month delay. But then after that, every plan has to be in place by July 1st of the subsequent 3-year periods. As we continue through the amendments, and we have the company, each gas and electric companies have to promote the availability of state and federal rebates, tax credit, and incentives. The commission has to adopt regs to do so. And then there's also again, brought over from the House 169, you have the establishment of a green and healthy task force with a specified membership, and they have to make certain recommendations because some of their recommendations involve small minority and women and veteran-owned businesses. They have to have a Croson study, and there's language that adds that at the end of the amendments. Those are the amendments.
Move the amendments.
On the amendments, all in favor say aye. Any opposed? On the bill, discussion, please. Mr. Vice Chair, go ahead.
I believe there are still amendments, Bob, from Delegate Chi.
Yes. There is one additional amendment from Delegate Chi. She brought up during subcommittee that she would like to have from her version of the Empower Bill rewrite. And that was basically language that would have navigators available for purposes of doing home retrofits. And okay. That was from House 904, which is otherwise not taken up in the bill.
Yep, and I think that having read through the amendment, we do want to adopt the amendment. the intent of the amendment. I don't think that the amendment, the way it is drafted, actually conforms itself to the bill. So if it's okay with Delegate Shi, I'd like for her to withdraw her amendment. We will work on the language to get it in there, and we have some ideas, and then we will accept it as friendly on the floor.
That's fine. Vice Chair, thank you. We discussed that.
Okay. All right. There's no other amendments, right, Bob? Okay, move the bill as amended.
Any discussion?
Yep, Mr. Chair.
Please, Mr. Vice Chair.
Okay, so a couple things. First, I think for everybody's knowledge, the bulk of the bill has nothing to do with an increase in surcharge. And I think that if not for some other factors, I think that we would have a unanimous vote in here. The surcharge, it is kept as a surcharge. We are not rate basing it. And I'm going to come back to this point in a minute to allow utilities to gain another 10%. The 1.8 reduction, that is basically a conversion from what the number currently is on energy efficiency standards. And so it's just saying the same thing, just in a different manner. So that doesn't drive up any costs. I know that we had some discussion about an 80-20 before. The 80-20 here is different. It is 80% of the Empower program goes to what's called behind the meter. So really the purpose of Empower is to make homes safer, more energy efficient, and lower people's bills. And so we want 80% of that program to take place in people's homes. There are some things that utilities can do, like line loss voltage and other programs in front of the meter, and we still allow them to capture some of the program in front, but the bulk of this program is going to exist in people's homes. Additionally, to the utilities benefits, DHCD numbers, and this is what I will come back to, also kind of a second or a separate point. We are going to allow their numbers to count for the utility, which is a benefit to the utility because they are going to run a low and moderate income program, and that was Delegate Charkoudian's and I believe Senator Feldman's LMI bill that we already passed out, House Bill 169. So with that said, I think the bulk of the room and a lot of work went into this, and I want to thank Bob and Matt Carpenter from the amendment office. I know I made the joke that Matt's probably never going to talk to me again, but for all their hard work on this and putting that together. Now, the two parts that are going to end up probably being somewhat of a sticking point. The first is House Bill 169, which I know went amongst party lines, and the reason it is incorporated into this bill is so that we can convert the numbers similar to how we converted the previous surcharge or the previous reduction goal number to 1.8. We convert the numbers that were in 169 also over to greenhouse gas reductions, and those numbers line up. So they are similar to what is in 169, but we're essentially updating the program for that. The second part has to do with an amateurized balance, and there is right now about an $850 million amateurized balance out there that the utilities have that ratepayers still have to pay back. And it's come from, the best we can tell, 2016. I'm not sure if it was all that year, but it has essentially floated on the books and hasn't been paid back since that time period. And utilities have been allowed to collect interest off of that at the clip of about 7%. And it has been essentially cost ratepayers about $60 million. The PSC made an order in December that the utilities had to completely pay that off by December 31st, 2029. Realizing that that would be a bit of a shock to most ratepayers, we gave the utilities, and really ratepayers, that's ultimately why we did it, an additional 2 years so that they have to pay that balance off by December 31st, 2031. And then in this bill, and then going forward in perpetuity, and starting in 2032, that the expenses accrued in that year, or excuse me, the costs accrued in that year have to be expensed in that year, which is the same way it's being done today. It's the same way SMECO runs their program. And it's not really going to be an issue moving forward. But there is this pretty substantial, large balance hanging out there. Now, I'm aware that we all just got an email, unprofessionally, I would say, 30 seconds before committee, saying that this bill is going to make the Empower surcharge jump through the roof. And frankly, there's no citations behind the numbers. There's no real math behind the numbers. They just seem to be made up to further the narrative that the utilities want to rate base in power. And that is what they have tried to do from the entire start of this. But I do not find their numbers to be accurate under any calculation that we have done with multiple organizations under the 1.8% greenhouse gas reduction. Additionally, I had multiple utilities in my office to have conversations around that. And all of them said they could live with the 1.8% reduction and didn't think that that was going to significantly impact rates, that portion of the bill. So the bill in and of itself doesn't touch doesn't raise the Empower surcharge any differently than what it is today. So, I'm not exactly sure where they came up with this stuff, but they also mentioned in their email that they have a safety valve, which really just undermines the customer prescriptions that are set in the bill. And they're going to use the 10% limit to argue against paying down the unamortized balance, and ultimately, ratepayers will continue to pay a higher interest rate for a balance that they haven't paid off. And so I'm not willing to accept that. I've told them, please come in, show me the numbers. But I find it just completely disingenuous, and it's tough to work with people who just won't be upfront and honest with you and bring you the numbers, within a professional amount of time, or just continue to just throw things at people and confuse people and muddy the waters or not act in good faith. And I really do believe that that has happened. So with that, I have nothing else, Mr. Chair.
I have a question. So the bill is drafted. Does it address the outstanding money that is owed basically by the ratepayer to the utility?
Yes, it does.
And how does it address it?
It gives the ratepayers an additional 2 years to pay off that balance. So they're going to have to do it anyway. The utilities are going to have to collect that off ratepayers by December.
Why is that? Why? Are we the ones telling them, as far as the extra 2 years, who set the original number?
The PSC set the number in December of 2022.
And what was that requirement?
December 31st, 2029.
That what?
That the utilities collect that full amount from the ratepayers, and so that there's no more balance going forward.
What's the problem with having a balance going forward?
Their ratepayers are going to continue to pay interest on money that, frankly, nobody's done anything to earn. And it's not the utilities' fault that they're in this position. It just kind of happened.
Okay. So right now, I just want people to understand that, because there's emails going around, and right now there are two issues. There's this bill, there's the extra 2 years, but there's also a PSC order, which you guys need to get rid of this debt. And we don't want to be under this debt anymore by the utilities. We need to get this taken care of versus stretching it out. Because if anybody knows, like a credit card, when you keep any balance on a credit card, what happens? They just keep collecting interest. That's the fatal flaw in the way the utilities have been handling this. All, like you said, while it's not their fault, it was to their benefit. So this is us, as ratepayers, having a credit card debt that we have to pay off versus having a credit card company. It's like, just lets us keep paying the minimum amount, because in doing so, we never get rid of the debt. They make a lot of money on interest. Delegate Charkoudian. I'm sorry, was that a good wrap-up of the issue? Delegate Charkoudian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to add a little bit of context. Vice Chair Crosby said 60 million. I wanted to make sure everyone knows it's 60 million a year that ratepayers are paying off of this. And it started in 2007. Originally, it was, when you're saying it's not the utility's fault, it was the PSC's order initially to allow them to have this balance. But over time, as the PSC has directed them and there's been work groups to consider paying this off, the utilities have consistently argued to those work groups, and as recently as February to the PSC, that they should not, and that it should continue to be carried at the cost of an additional 56 million a year to ratepayers, in addition to the eventual 800 million that will need to be paid off. So it is a cost that has to be paid at some point. I share the outrage that it's being tied to this bill, as though it's this bill that's raising it, as opposed to this bill that's requiring the utilities to be transparent and honest about a debt that's owed and that needs to be paid off so we don't continue to pay interest. But I do understand why they would be resisting this, because they stand to lose $56 million of interest a year when this gets paid off. And so I just think that that context is important as well.
Apologize. Bill has been moved and properly seconded, I believe. So we will go, Vice Chair Crosby. On the favorable as amended, Delegate Harrison. Delegate Boafo. Delegate Howard. Delegate Charkoudian. Delegate Rose. Delegate Pruski. Delegate Fennell is excused. Delegate Turner. Delegate Sample Hughes. Delegate Valderrama. Delegate Chi. Delegate Frazier Hildago. Delegate Adams. Delegate Aaron's. Delegate Pippy. Delegate Jackson. Excused. Delegate Johnson. Delegate Rogers. Delegate Ampry. Delegate Wyville. Delegate Fisher. Next bill, please.
Okay, Senate Bill 62 is nearly identical to House Bill 62 as it passed the House. This is the pollinator-friendly vegetation management language that limits what localities can do with respect to utility right-of-way maintenance. Is that the Senate added some uncodified intent language at the end, saying that the bill isn't meant to interfere with weed control regulations under Maryland Department of Agriculture or other vegetation management that is not in utility rights of way. That's not, I'm saying that's what the difference is between the Senate version as it's in front of us and the bill that we sent out. Otherwise, the bill is identical.
On the favorable, any discussion? Seeing none, Delegate Crosby.
Aye.
Delegate Harrison. Delegate Boafo. Delegate Howard. Delegate Charkoudian. Delegate Rose. Delegate Pruski. Delegate Fennell is excused. Delegate Turner. Delegate Sample Hughes. Delegate Valderrama. Delegate Chi. Delegate Frazier Hildago. Delegate Adams. Delegate Aaron's. Delegate Pippy. Delegate Jackson. Apologize. Excused. Delegate Johnson. Delegate Rogers. Delegate Ampry. Delegate Wyville. Delegate Fisher. Delegate Queen. Bill moves favorable. Next bill.
Senate Bill 781 is the cross-file to House Bill 793. I don't have an amendment, but it would be presumably you'd amend it to conform it to what just passed the House committee.
We're moving to conform, correct?
Correct.
Moving to conform.
All in favor of the motion to conform to the House bill?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Move the bill as conformed.
Thank you. Delegate Crosby.
Aye.
Delegate Harrison. Delegate Boafo. Delegate Howard. Delegate Charkoudian. Delegate Rose. Delegate Pruski. Delegate Fennell is excused. Delegate Turner. Delegate Sample Hughes. Delegate Valderrama. Delegate Chi. Delegate Frazier Hildago. Delegate Adams. Delegate Aaron's. Delegate Pippy. Delegate Jackson is excused. Delegate Johnson. Delegate Rogers. Delegate Ampry. Delegate Wyville. Delegate Fisher. Delegate Queen. Bill moves as amended. Colleagues, that's all for today. Be prepared to vote again every day when we can. We have hearings tomorrow. There'll be no hearings tomorrow.
Hearings tomorrow, but we will have voting.
There's no hearings tomorrow, guys, but we will have voting once we get off the floor. Thank you guys very much. See everybody at the freshman party. Good?
max achievable, $25. The bill doesn't change anything.